I've kept a ledger every day of my working life. Cattle bought, cattle sold, the price of feed when the rains failed, the wage I paid a man and the wage I owed him still. Numbers don't lie, my father used to say, and for 61 years I believed him. Then Silas Crane sat across my kitchen table and asked me to help him lie about everything he owned. And I learned that the truest thing a man can write in a ledger is a question he's afraid to ask out loud. This is the story of the richest man in 3 counties who wanted, more than he wanted his next breath, to be poor. Not forever, just long enough to find out who would still be standing beside him when the money was gone. I thought it was foolishness. I told him so. But I wrote it all down anyway, the way I write everything down, and I have that ledger still. The pages are soft at the corners now from how many times I've gone back to them. I go back because I need to be sure I remember it right. Because what happened to Silas Crane and to the woman nobody expected changed what I thought I knew about love and worth and the quiet arithmetic of the human heart. Let me start where it started, not at the beginning of his money, at the end of his certainty. The knock came near midnight, and no honest business knocks that late. I was still up. I don't sleep the way I did when I was young, and the ledger for the month wasn't going to balance itself. Rain had been coming down since supper, the slow, steady kind that soaks a man to the bone before he knows he's wet. I heard the horse first, then the boots on my porch uneven, like the man wearing them had ridden further than his legs wanted to carry him. I opened the door with the lamp in one hand and my other hand near the shotgun by the frame, because a man alone on a ranch learns caution the way he learns to breathe. It was Silas Crane. I'd have known him anywhere, though I'd only ever seen him at a distance. At the stock auctions in Cordell, up on the buyer's platform where the big money sat, or driving past in that black-lacquered buggy with the matched grays that cost more than my whole remuda. Silas Crane owned the Bar Double C, which was to say he owned most of the good grassland between the Washita and the county line, and a bank besides, and a share in the railroad spur they'd run out to the stockyards. He was the kind of rich that other rich men were careful around. And he was standing on my porch dripping like a drowned dog, hat in his hands, looking at me with an expression I'd never seen on a wealthy man's face in all my years. He looked lost. "Amos Teller," he said, though he knew my name. Everyone did small business with the Bar Double C sooner or later, and I'd sold him beef on the hoof twice. "You know it's me," I said, "and you know what hour it is." "I do." He turned the hat in his hands. Water ran off the brim and pooled on my boards. "I wouldn't have come if I had anywhere else to go where a man wouldn't talk." Now that was a strange thing to say. A man like Silas Crane had 100 places to go and 100 men who jumped to open the door. But I'd lived long enough to know that a full house and an empty one can sit in the same chest, and something in the way he said it made me step back and wave him in out of the rain. I put coffee on. I didn't offer him whiskey, though I had it, because a man who comes to you at midnight with that face doesn't need his judgment loosened any further. He sat at my kitchen table, a plain table, scarred from 30 years of my elbows, and he looked around my little house like it was something he'd forgotten existed. Plank walls, a stove, my ledger open under the lamp. The smell of leather and coffee and wood smoke. "You keep books," he said, nodding at the ledger. "Every day. Even the bad days. Especially those. The bad days are the ones you need the truth about later." I set the coffee in front of him. His hands were shaking, just slightly, and it wasn't the cold. "Mr. Crane, you didn't ride through a storm at midnight to talk about bookkeeping." He wrapped both hands around the cup, like he was trying to remember what warm felt like. And then he told me a thing that I have written in my ledger word for word, because I didn't trust my memory to hold it the way it deserved to be held. "My wife died 4 years ago," he said. "You knew that?" I did. Half the county had gone to the funeral. Eleanor Crane had been a fine woman by all accounts, and Silas had put up a headstone that people rode out just to look at. After she passed, I had money and nothing else, so I started courting, I suppose you'd call it, though I'm too old and it was too foolish for that word. There were women. There are always women when a man has what I have. He said it without pride. He said it the way you'd report a leak in a roof. I couldn't tell you a single true thing about any of them, whether they laughed at my jokes because the jokes were funny or because I signed the checks. Whether a woman held my hand because she wanted to, or because holding my hand is good business. He looked up at me. I'm 63 years old, Mr. Teller, and I have realized that I do not know, I have never known, whether one living soul on this earth would cross a room to reach me if I couldn't pay them too. The rain filled the silence. I didn't fill it. I've learned that when a man is finally saying the true thing, you let him. There's a woman, he said, Rachel Doyle. She runs the boarding house in Cordell, the clean one by the church. Widow, he stopped, and for the first time something other than fear crossed his face, something younger. She doesn't treat me like a bank. When I come to town, I stop for her cooking, and she talks to me like I'm a man and not a fortune. I've come to care what she thinks, more than I've cared about anything since a leaner. Then you're a lucky man, I said. Or I'm a fool who wants so badly to be loved that I've talked myself into believing a kind word is more than a kind word. He set the cup down hard enough that coffee slopped over the rim, and he didn't seem to notice. I have to know, Mr. Teller, before I'm too old to have anything but knowing. I have to know if she'd have me poor. And then he laid it out, this plan of his, and I understood at last why he'd come to me and not to any of his fine friends. He wanted to become poor. Not truly, a man can't unspend 40 years of accumulation in a night, and there was the bank and the railroad share and all the rest. But he could disappear from it. He could put out the story that Silas Crane had been ruined, a bad speculation, a run on the bank, a cattle disease, the details didn't matter, and that he'd lost everything and gone to work as a common hand to keep from starving, and he needed a ranch to go work at. A real one with real work, run by a man honest enough to keep the secret and plain enough that no one would think to look for the richest man in the county sleeping in his bunkhouse. He needed me. I'll pay you, he started. I know you will, that's the trouble with you, and you just told me so yourself. I closed the ledger. You came here because I don't need your money enough to lie to you, and now you want to buy me. You see the knot you're tying. He had the grace to flinch. I should have said no. I want to put that down plainly, because everything that followed from my not saying it. A wiser man, or a colder one, would have sent Silas Crane back into the rain to nurse his loneliness like the rest of us do, quietly, and without dragging the neighbors into it. But I was 61, and my wife was 12 years in the ground, and my sons had gone to Kansas and California and hadn't written since spring. And I knew, God help me, I knew exactly, the particular ache of a man who wonders whether anyone would come if he called. I'd lain awake with that ache more nights than I'd admit to a living soul. So I didn't say no. I said, you'll work, I mean it. I don't keep men who don't. If you're going to be poor, you're going to find out what poor feels like in the hands and the back, not just in the story we tell. Rich man playing at hardship is the ugliest thing I know, and I won't have it under my roof. Something eased in his shoulders. I think he'd been braced for pity, and I'd handed him a day's work instead, and that was closer to what he actually needed. And another thing, I leaned across the table. If this woman, Rachel, if she's what you hope she is, then you're about to lie to the best thing left in your life. You understand that? You're going to test her love by deceiving her. And love that's been tested with a lie doesn't always forgive the lie once it's passed the test. You might win and lose in the same breath. I know, he said quietly. I've thought of nothing else. Then God help the both of you. I got up and refilled his coffee. You start Monday. Silas Crane died in the storm tonight, far as anyone knows. What's your name going to be? He thought about it a long moment. Sam, he said. Sam Cole. It was my father's name was Sam. Sam Cole. I wrote it in the ledger, first entry. Hired one hand, Sam Cole, no wages agreed, no references. Monday next. And underneath it, in smaller letters, a note only I would ever understand. God forgive me for helping a man break his own heart to be sure it still works. He came Monday, and I'll say this for Silas Crane, Sam Cole. I'd best call him now, he didn't do it halfway. He showed up in clothes I could tell he'd bought worn on purpose, and I made him work in them till they were worn honest. First morning I put him on the manure fork mucking out the horse stalls, and I watched from the corral rail to see if the richest man in 3 counties would balk at shit on his boots. He didn't. He gagged twice, quiet, turning his head so I wouldn't see, and then he set his jaw and worked till the stalls were clean. His hands blistered by noon. By the 3rd day they'd torn open, and by the end of the 1st week they'd started to callous, and I watched him look at his own palms one evening with an expression I couldn't read, something between horror and wonder, like a man discovering he'd had these hands all along and never used them. They hurt, he told me. We were sitting on the bunkhouse steps in the blue dusk, both of us too tired to talk much. which is the best kind of company. They'll stop, then they'll hurt in a different place. I filled my pipe. That's the whole of it, mostly. You just move the ache around till you die. He laughed at that, the first real laugh I'd heard from him, not the careful chuckle of a man at a business dinner. A real one surprised out of him. I learned things about him in those first weeks that I don't think he knew about himself. He was a hard worker, which surprised me. I'd expected a soft man under all that money, and found instead a man who'd simply forgotten he could do things with his body. He'd started life poor, it turned out. Dirt poor on a hard-scrabble place in Arkansas, and he'd clawed his way up through cattle and land and cleverness, and a marriage to a woman whose father had a little money. And somewhere in 40 years of clawing, he'd climbed so high he'd forgotten the ground was ever there. Coming back to it broke something loose in him. "I forgot I knew how to do this," he said one night, meaning the whole of it, the roping, the mending, the plain animal tiredness of real work. "I've had men to do it for me so long I forgot I ever could. What else did I forget, Amos? What else did I have and give away for money?" I didn't have an answer. I'm a rancher, not a preacher. I wrote it in my ledger that night, though, the way I write things I want to keep. Sam asked what else he gave away for money. I think he's afraid the answer is everything. And every week on Saturday, he'd ride into Cordell. I knew where he was going. He'd come back different, lighter or heavier, one or the other, never the same. And after a while he started telling me, sitting on those bunkhouse steps in the dark, because a man has to tell someone or the telling builds up in him like water behind a dam. He'd gone to Rachel Doyle the first Saturday as a ruined man. Told her the story we'd cooked up, that he'd lost everything, that he was working as a hand out at Teller's place to keep body and soul together, that he was sorry. He understood if she didn't want a poor man calling. And Rachel Doyle had looked at him. He told me this with his voice gone strange, and she'd said, "Selah's Crane, you great fool, did you think I fed you all those months for your money? Sit down. You look thin. When did you last eat something that wasn't beans?" And she'd fed him, and she hadn't asked him for a thing. She didn't even blink, he said, wonder and terror in equal measure. I told her I was ruined, and she just worried I wasn't eating. "Sounds like your answer," I said. "No," he shook his head, and here's where I first understood how deep the sickness went in him, the sickness of a man who's been rich and lonely too long. "No, it's too easy. She's a boarding house keeper, Amos. She's kind to everyone. She'd feed any stray that wandered in. That's not the same as choosing me. I have to be sure, I have to be more poor, more ruined. I have to see if she'll stand it when it costs her something." And there it was, the trap I'd seen from the first night, closing on him slow. A man who cannot believe he's loved will keep raising the price of the proof until he's bankrupted the very thing he was trying to buy. I'd seen it in horse traders who couldn't stop dealing, in gamblers, in my own self some grieving nights. There is no amount of proof that satisfies a man determined to doubt. "Sam," I said, I'd got in the habit by then. "Listen to an old man. There's a point where testing a thing becomes the thing that breaks it. You keep pushing on that woman's kindness to see if it'll crack, and one day it'll crack, and it won't be because she didn't love you. It'll be because you leaned on it till it broke. And you'll take that for your answer when it's really just what you did with your own 2 hands." He heard me, I could see him hear me, and I watched him set it aside because the fear in him was older and stronger than my one night's wisdom. "Just once more," he said. "One more test, a real one, and then I'll stop and I'll tell her everything and I'll marry her if she'll have me." I didn't believe him, but I nodded and I wrote it down and I hoped I was wrong. The test he devised was a cruel one, and I told him so, and he did it anyway. There was a man in Cordell named Deacon, Harlan Deacon, who ran the mercantile and had money and had been sniffing around Rachel Doyle's boarding house for the better part of a year. A widower like Selah's, but a hard, tight-fisted, prosperous man, the sort who counts a widow's assets before he counts her virtues. He'd made Rachel an offer of marriage that spring. She'd turned him down, but he hadn't stopped coming around, the way that kind doesn't. Selah's plan was this. He would arrange, through a third party, for Deacon to learn that Rachel had been keeping company with a ruined ranch hand. And Deacon, being who he was, would go to Rachel and press his suit hard, would offer her security, comfort, a fine house, everything the poor Sam Cole couldn't. And Selah's would find a way to be there, or to hear of it, and he would see with his own eyes whether Rachel Doyle would choose the wealthy man or the poor one. "It's the only true test," he told me, feverish with it now. "Everything else she can be kind about, but this is choosing. This is her turning down a fortune to stand by a pauper. If she does that, Amos, then I'll know, then I'll finally know. And if she chooses Deacon, I asked. If she's a widow of a certain age with a business to keep up and a hard winter coming, and she looks at a prosperous man offering her ease and she says yes, the way half the sensible women in this county would, what then? You'll have your answer that she never loved you, when the truth is you never gave her the chance to love the real you at all. You gave her a lie and dared her to fail it. He didn't answer me. He'd stopped answering me by then on this subject. The fear had him. I want to tell you I refuse to have any part of it. But the truth, and I keep a ledger of truth, so I'll set it down, is that I didn't stop him. I told him he was wrong. I told him he was cruel to her and to himself. And then I stood aside and let a lonely man walk toward the cliff edge because I'd already helped him climb the mountain, and a man who helps you halfway to your ruin has forfeited the right to much clean feeling about the rest. So the trap was set, word reached Deacon. And on a cold Saturday in the last of October, Harlan Deacon put on his good coat and drove out to Rachel Doyle's boarding house to win himself a wife, not knowing that the ruined ranch hand watching from across the street was the richest man in 3 counties, and that a whole life's happiness was about to turn on what a widow said in the next 10 minutes. I wasn't there for what happened next. Sam told me after, and I've set it down as he told it. But some of it he couldn't tell, his voice gave out, and some of it I've had to imagine, and some of it I don't think anyone will ever rightly know. What I do know is that he came back that night changed all the way through. He came into the bunkhouse near dawn, and he sat down on the edge of his bunk, and he put his face in his ruined, calloused hands, and the richest man in 3 counties wept like something in him had broken past mending. I got up, I put the coffee on, and I waited for him to tell me what a man finds at the bottom of the thing he was most afraid to know. He didn't tell me that night, he couldn't. He only said one thing, near morning, in a voice I'd never heard from him. Amos, he said, I got exactly what I asked for, and I'd give it all back, all of it, every acre to have asked for something else. Ledger that night, Sam back before dawn, something happened at Rachel's, he won't say what, wrote nothing else. Some nights the truth's too heavy for the pen. He didn't tell me for 3 days. 3 days he worked like a man trying to bury something in the ground with his own hands. He mended fence that didn't need mending. He broke a green colt I'd been meaning to sell, gentled it in the round pen from dawn till the light went, and when it was done, he stood with his forehead against the animal's neck for a long while, and I left him to it. A man will tell a horse things he can't yet tell another man. I've done it myself. On the 4th night he came and sat on the bunkhouse steps where we'd done most of our talking, and he had a bottle this time, and I let him. There are truths that won't come out sober, and I judged this was one of them. You were right, he said, that was how he started. About all of it, I want that written down, Amos. In your book, Amos Teller was right and Silas Crane was a fool, and it cost more than money, which is the only thing the fool ever knew how to count. Tell me what happened, I said. And he did, slow at first, then all in a rush, the way a wound bleeds once you finally take the pressure off it. He'd been across the street when Deacon's buggy pulled up outside Rachel Doyle's boarding house. He'd found himself a spot in the alley beside the feed store where a man could stand in shadow and watch the front porch, and he'd stood there in the cold with his collar up and his hat down, and he'd hated himself the whole time, he said. Hated what he was doing, and couldn't stop doing it. I told myself I was being careful, he said. Prudent, that's the word I used in my own head, prudent. Like I was inspecting a piece of property before I bought it. That's what 40 years of money does to a man, Amos. It turns even love into a transaction he thinks he's too smart to be cheated in. Deacon had gone up the steps in his good coat, carrying something, flowers, Silas thought, though it was hard to see. He'd knocked. Rachel had come to the door, and even from across the street Silas could see her go still at the sight of him, the way you go still when someone unwelcome arrives, and you're deciding how much of your Sunday manners to spend on them. They'd talked on the porch a while, Silas couldn't hear it. And then Rachel had stood back and let Deacon in, and the door had closed, and Silas Crane had stood in that freezing alley for the better part of an hour staring at a closed door, and imagining every word being said behind it, and every word he imagined was worse than the last. That's the thing nobody tells you about jealousy, he said. It's not that you think the worst, it's that you author it. I stood there and I wrote whole conversations in my head. I had her taking his hand. I had her laughing at whatever a man like Deacon thinks is charm. I had them setting a wedding date. By the time that door opened again, I'd married them off and buried myself, and none of it had happened. None of it was real. I'd just done it to myself, standing in the cold, because I'd rather torture myself with a story I controlled than wait for a truth I couldn't. I didn't write that down till later, but I never forgot it. I've known that alley. Every man who's ever loved and doubted has stood in some version of that alley, authoring his own ruin because the waiting is worse than the wound. The door had opened, Deacon had come out. And here Silas stopped and drank, and I waited. He came out fast, Silas said. And his face, Amos, I've been in enough deals to read a man's face across a street. He came out like a man who'd been refused, stiff, angry. He jammed his hat on and he got in that buggy and he whipped the horse harder than a good man whips a horse, and he was gone. And I stood there and something in my chest just lifted. For 1 second. 1 second I was the happiest I'd been in 4 years because she'd said no to him. She'd turned down the money. She'd chosen. He stopped. She'd chosen the poor man, I said. She'd chosen you. That's what I thought. His voice had gone flat and terrible. That's what I thought for exactly as long as it took Rachel to come out onto that porch after him. She'd come out, he said, onto the porch into the cold without a shawl, her arms wrapped around herself. And she'd watched Deacon's buggy go down the street. And Silas had watched her from the alley and he'd seen her face. She wasn't triumphant. She wasn't relieved. She looked, he searched a long time for the word. And the one he landed on was the one that undid him. She looked bereaved. She stood there, he said, and she watched him drive off, and she looked like a woman watching the last good thing sail away from her. And I didn't understand it. I'd just seen her refuse him. Why would a woman who turned a man down look like her heart was breaking to see him go? So he'd done a foolish thing on top of all the foolish things. He'd stepped out of the alley. He'd let her see him. And Rachel Doyle had looked across the street and seen her ruined ranch hand standing there where he had no business being, having plainly watched the whole thing, and her face had done something he'd never forget. She'd looked ashamed, and then she'd looked angry. And then, worst of all, she'd looked sorry for him. And she'd crossed the street to him the way you cross a room to tell someone bad news gently. Sam, she'd said, that was still his name to her. How long have you been standing there? Long enough, he'd said. And Rachel Doyle had told him the truth. The whole of it, standing in the cold street with her arms wrapped around herself, and it was not the truth he'd built his test to find. Harlan Deacon held the note on the boarding house. That was the thing Silas hadn't known, the thing none of his careful scheming had turned up, because you can't discover a person's private desperation by testing their affection. Rachel's late husband had borrowed against the property in his last sick year, borrowed from the bank, and the bank had sold the paper, and the paper had ended up in Harlan Deacon's tight fist, which was surely no accident. Deacon had been holding that note over her for a year. His proposals of marriage had always carried the same quiet arithmetic underneath. Marry me and the debt disappears. Refuse me and one day I'll call it and you'll lose everything you have. She'd refused him all year. She'd refused him again that very afternoon. And that afternoon he'd finally told her plainly that his patience was at its end, that she had until the new year to reconsider, that after that he would call the note and she would lose the boarding house, the only thing she had, the work of her whole widowed life, the roof over the heads of the 4 boarders who depended on her, and she would have nothing. That was why she'd looked bereaved watching him go. Not because she loved him, because she'd just watched her last chance to save her home drive off down the street in a fury, and she'd chosen, again, for the last time, to lose everything rather than marry a man she couldn't stand. She chose to be ruined, Silas said, rather than marry for money. Do you understand what I'm telling you, Amos? I built a whole scheme to find out if a woman would choose a poor man over a rich one. And while I was building it, while I was standing in an alley congratulating myself on my clever test, she was actually doing it, for real, with her whole life on the line. She turned down the money and the security and the roof over her head, and she did it not to pass some test I'd set, because she didn't know there was a test. She did it because she couldn't make herself marry where she didn't love. She did the exact thing I was testing for, and she did it real, and she did it while I stood across the street playing pretend. He put his face in his hands. And here's the part I can't, his voice broke. She told me all this thinking she was confessing her ruin to me, to Sam Cole, to a poor ranch hand who had nothing to offer. She stood there and told me she was about to lose everything, and do you know what she was afraid of, Amos? She was afraid I'd think less of her. She said she understood if I didn't want to court a woman with no home and no money coming. She was apologizing to me for being poor. She thought she'd become as poor as me, and she was apologizing for it and asking if I'd still have her. I had to get up and walk out into the yard after he told me that. I'm not ashamed to say it. I'm an old man and I've buried a wife, and I thought I was past being moved to my feet by another man's story. But I had to walk out under the cold stars a minute and get my own face in order before I could go back and hear the rest. Because I understood then the full weight of what Silas Crane had done. He'd built a test to find one honest woman in a world he'd decided was full of liars, and he'd found her. She was real. She was standing right in front of him, so honest it hurt, so honest she'd choose ruin over a comfortable lie, and he had answered that honesty with the deepest deception of his life. He was not a poor man. He was the richest man in 3 counties. He could have paid off Deacon's note with the loose money in his desk drawer and never felt it. He could have made her whole with a stroke of a pen. And he'd been standing in an alley testing her. The woman who just proved herself the one true thing he'd been searching 4 years to find. He'd found her in the act of lying to her. I went back inside. He was still sitting there. "What did you say to her?" I asked. "In the street, when she told you all this. And this is the part that I think he'll carry to his grave, and maybe past it." "I panicked," he said. "Amos, I'd waited 4 years to find a woman like her, and I found her in the worst moment I could have, with a lie in my mouth I didn't know how to swallow. She's standing there apologizing to me for being poor, and the truth is right there. I could have said it. 3 words. I have money. I could have told her everything right there in the street and paid off Deacon by Monday, and none of the rest would have happened. It was right there. The whole rest of both our lives was standing in that 3-word door, and all I had to do was walk through it. And you didn't." I got scared. He laughed, and it was an awful sound. 63 years old, and I got scared like a boy. Because if I told her the truth right then, right when she needed money, right when a fortune would save her home, then I'd never know, would I? I'd never know if she came to me for me or for the rescue. I'd have saved her and lost the only answer I ever wanted. So I stood there and I let her keep thinking I was poor, and I said, he couldn't get it out at first. I said, "I don't think less of you, Rachel. A poor man's got no room to look down on anybody." And I let her believe it. I let her walk back into that house believing she'd confessed her ruin to another ruined soul, and that we were 2 poor people who understood each other. I let the lie stand. Because I was too much of a coward, and too far gone in my own sickness, to give up the test even when the answer was standing in front of me weeping. We sat a long time after that. The bottle was most gone. The stars had wheeled over some ways. "Amos," he said finally, "I have to fix it, but every way I turn it I make it worse. If I pay off the note as Sam Cole, a poor ranch hand doesn't have that kind of money, she'll know something's wrong and the lie unravels ugly. If I go to her as Silas Crane and pay it, then I've been lying to her for months, and worse, I did it while testing her, and no woman with the pride to refuse Deacon all year is going to forgive being played like a hand of cards. And if I do nothing," he stopped. "If I do nothing, the new year comes, and Deacon calls the note, and she loses her home. And I let it happen. I let the one honest woman in the world lose everything when I could have saved her with the money I was too busy testing her to spend." He looked at me, and there was no rich man left in his face at all. Just a frightened old fellow at the bottom of a hole he'd dug himself, one careful, clever shovelful at a time. "What do I do?" he said. It wasn't really a question. It was the sound a man makes when he's run out of his own answers. And I want to tell you I had wisdom for him. I want to tell you that the old rancher sat back and lit his pipe and laid out the path that made it all come right. But I keep a ledger of the truth, and the truth is I didn't know either. There was no clean way out. He'd built a maze with no center and walked himself into it, and any door he opened now led out onto some kind of grief. So I told him the only true thing I had. "You're asking me how to lie your way out of a lie," I said. "And there isn't a way. There's never been a way. A lie's a debt, Sam, same as any other, and every day you carry it the interest grows, and there's only one way to clear a debt. You pay it, in full, and it's going to cost you everything you were trying to protect because that's what the interest came to while you weren't paying." "You mean tell her the truth?" "I mean tell her the truth, all of it, that you're Silas Crane, that you were never ruined. That you tested her, that you stood in an alley and watched her nearly lose her home and said nothing. Tell her the whole ugly shape of it and don't dress up a word, and then..." I paused. "And then let her do whatever she does, because you don't get to control that part. You gave up the right to control it the night you decided her love had to pass an exam. She gets to fail you now if she chooses. That's what you're owed. That's the whole bill. He was quiet. She'll never have me, he said. Maybe not. I'll lose her. You might lose her. I knocked out my pipe. But you've already lost the woman who thought Sam Cole was an honest, poor man who understood her. That woman's gone. Whatever you do, she never existed. You invented her to fool a real one. The only woman left to lose is Rachel Doyle, who's strong enough to choose ruin over a lie. And a woman like that, I looked at him. A woman like that might just be strong enough to forgive one too if it's laid down honest and complete and asking for nothing. But not if you manage it, not if you engineer it. You've engineered enough. You go to her with empty hands and the whole truth and no plan, or you don't go at all. He decided to go. 2 days before he did, though, the thing turned again, the way these things do, because a man doesn't get to schedule his reckoning, and the world doesn't wait for us to be ready. Deacon moved first. Word came into Cordell. I heard it from my hired girl who'd been to town for flour, that Harlan Deacon had called the note early. Not the new year. Now, whether he'd got wind that Rachel was keeping company with a ranch hand, whether his pride couldn't stand another month of being refused, whether he was simply the kind of man who enjoys the crushing more than the getting, I don't know. But he'd gone to the county and started the paper that would take Rachel Doyle's boarding house before Christmas and put her and her 4 boarders out in the cold of the hardest month of the year. Silas learned it the same afternoon I did. I watched the news land on him, and I watched something happen in his face that I'd been waiting weeks to see and had half given up on. The fear went out of it. All those weeks the fear had been running him, the fear of not being loved, the fear of not knowing, the fear that had turned a good man into a schemer in an alley. And the moment he understood that Rachel was about to lose everything for real and soon, and that his testing time was over whether he liked it or not, the fear just went. Burned off him like fog in the sun. Because you can't be afraid of losing an answer when the person you love is about to lose their home. The one grief is so much bigger than the other that it swallows it whole. I have to go to her, he said, and it wasn't frightened anymore, it was just true. Yes, I said. Right now. Tonight. Yes. He saddled the colt he'd gentled, the green one, the one he'd wept against, and I noticed he did it, because a man rides his best horse when he's not sure he's coming back, and I didn't say anything about that. He put on the worn coat, and at the last, with his boot in the stirrup, he stopped and looked at me, and I'll set down what he said because it was the closest thing to a whole man I'd yet heard come out of him. If she throws me out, he said, I want you to know it'll be a just thing. I don't want you riding to town to defend me or explain me or soften it. I earned whatever she gives me. A man ought to be willing to stand and take the bill he ran up. That's the one honest thing I've got left to do, and I'd be obliged if you'd let me do it clean. Go on then, I said. And Sam, he looked back. Silas, whichever man you are when you get there, go as that one. Don't be Sam Cole on her porch. Don't be the rich man either, come to buy his way clear. Just be whatever's left when you take both those off. That's the fellow she'll either have or she won't. He nodded, and he rode out into the dark toward Cordell, toward the woman he'd wronged and the truth he'd been running from for 4 years. And I stood in my yard and watched the dark take him. And I did not know, I want to be honest, I did not know whether I'd just sent a man to save his life or finish ruining it. I went inside, I opened the ledger. I sat a long while with the pen not moving. Then I wrote Sam rode to Cordell tonight to tell Rachel the truth. Deacons called the note early. I don't know how this ends. First time in years I've wanted the numbers to lie. Ledger later that same night, added in a different hand, unsteady, because I'd taken a drink myself by then. There's a thing an old man forgets and a scared one never learns, that the truth doesn't ruin us near as often as the lie we told to keep from telling it. Silas spent 4 years and a fortune's worth of scheming to find out if he could be loved poor. And the answer was in Cordell the whole time, keeping a clean boarding house by the church, choosing ruin over a comfortable lie, apologizing to a stranger for having nothing. He'd already found her. He just couldn't stop testing long enough to keep her. I don't know what she'll say. I'll set it down in part 3, whatever it is, the true amount, no padding, the way I keep every account. But I keep thinking about the two of them, 2 people who'd both rather lose everything than lie about love. One of them managed to do it and stay honest. The other one lied his way through it and might lose her for the lie. And I can't for the life of me stop wondering which of those is the braver, and which is only the... He was gone 2 days. I'll tell you first that he came back, because I remember the 2 days I didn't know it, and I wouldn't wish that not knowing on you even for the length of a page. He rode out on a Tuesday night, and he didn't come back Wednesday, and he didn't come back Wednesday night. And by Thursday morning, I'd saddled my own horse twice and unsaddled it twice, because I'd promised the man I'd let him take his own bill and not ride to town to soften it. And keeping that promise was one of the hardest chores I ever did on that place, and I've dug graves. He came back Thursday near noon. I was mending harness in the barn, and I heard the colt in the yard, and I came out, and there he was, sitting the horse, and I couldn't read him at all. He'd gone somewhere in those 2 days that had put a stillness on him I didn't have the measure of yet. He got down slow, older than when he'd left, it seemed, and I don't mean the 2 days. "Coffee," he said. "And then I'll tell you. And Amos," he handed me the reins, and his hands, I saw, were steady now, all the shake gone out of them. "It's a long telling, and it doesn't come out the way either of us thought. He'd got to Cordell late that first night, he told me, and he'd nearly turned back twice on the road, and he'd made himself keep going by an old horse trader's trick. Don't think about the whole distance, just get to the next fence post. Just the next one. He'd got himself to Rachel's porch one fence post at a time, and he'd knocked, and it had taken her a while to come because it was late. And when she opened the door in her wrapper with a lamp in her hand and saw it was Sam, her face had done that soft, worried thing it did. "Sam, it's the middle of the night. What's wrong? Are you hurt?" And he'd stood on her porch, and he'd found that all the speeches he'd made up on the road had gone out of his head, every one, and what came out instead was just the plain first thing. "My name isn't Sam Cole," he'd said, "and I'm not poor, I never was. I have to tell you something, Rachel, and it's bad, and I need you to let me get all the way to the end of it before you throw me off your porch, because I've earned the throwing and I'll go when you say. But let me get to the end first, please." He said her face changed by degrees as he talked. He made himself tell it all in order, holding nothing back, who he was, the whole scheme, the alley, the test, the moment in the street when she'd apologized to him for being poor, and he'd let the lie stand rather than give up his answer. He told her he'd known about Deacon's note only after, and that he could have paid it any day with money he wouldn't miss and hadn't because he was too busy testing her to save her. He didn't soften a word of it. He said the worst parts plainest, because he'd decided on the road that the one dignity left to him was to not make it sound better than it was. And Rachel Doyle stood in her doorway with the lamp and heard the whole thing, and she didn't throw him off the porch. She did something worse. When he finished, she was quiet a long moment, and then she said, very low, "So all of it was a test, every supper, every time you sat at my table and let me feed you and worry about you being thin. I thought I was feeding a poor man because it was the decent thing. And the whole time I was the mouse, and you were watching to see which way I'd run." "Rachel, don't," she wasn't shouting. He said he almost wished she'd shouted. "You want to know the thing you'll have to carry, Sela's crane? I'll tell you since you came all this way for the truth. I did love you, Sam Cole, the poor one. I loved him because he'd lost everything and kept working, kept his back straight, didn't beg or scheme, just worked and came to see me on Saturdays and treated me like I was worth something even though neither of us had a dime. That's the man I fell in love with, and you're standing here telling me that man never existed. You didn't lie to me about your money, Sela's, that I could forgive. You lied to me about him. You made me love a man you invented to trick me, and now you've come to take him away, and there's no—" her voice had gone, and she'd got it back. "There's no place in the world I can go to see him again. You killed the only man I've loved since my husband, and it turns out you did it on purpose, and it turns out he was you all along, and I don't have anywhere to put any of this." And she'd closed the door. Not slammed it, closed it. Sela said that was the worst part, that she was too heartbroken even to slam it. She just closed it, quiet, the way you close the door on a room where something's died. He'd got a room at the other boarding house, the poor one across town, and he'd sat up all that night. And here's where the story turns from the one I expected to the one that actually happened, and I've thought about the difference every day since. Any fool, and Sela's had been playing the fool for months, any fool in that chair would have spent the night scheming how to win her back. And that's what he started to do. He told me he had it half planned by 2 in the morning. He'd pay off Deacon's note quietly, save the house, and then let her find out somehow that her mysterious benefactor had been him, and she'd be so grateful and so moved that she'd forgive him, and it would all come right, and he'd have his rescue and his redemption both. And then he'd stopped, because he'd hurt himself. He was doing it again. Even now, even at the very bottom of it, with her heart broken and the truth all out, he was still trying to engineer the outcome. Still trying to arrange a result instead of doing a right thing and letting the result fall where it fell. He was going to use his money to buy her gratitude the way he'd once feared women used his money to fake their love, and he was going to call that redemption. I sat in that cold little room, he told me, and I finally saw the whole shape of my own sickness. It was never really about whether she loved me poor. It was that I wanted to control being loved. I wanted a love I'd tested and proved and could be certain of, a love with the risk taken out, and that's not love at all, Amos. That's an investment. I'd spent 40 years turning everything into an investment, and I'd done it to the last thing in my life that wasn't supposed to be won. And here I was at the bottom of the well, and my first instinct was to grab a shovel and start engineering my way to forgiveness. Buy the house, earn the gratitude, arrange the happy ending. Same disease, different day. So he'd made a decision, alone in that cold room, that I think was the first truly free thing he'd done in years. He'd pay off Deacon's note, he'd save Rachel's home, and she would never know it was him. He'd do the one thing his whole nature rebelled against, do a great kindness, and take no credit, buy nothing with it, not her gratitude, not her love, not even her knowing he'd done it. Save her home and disappear from her life entirely, because she'd asked him to in the only way she could, by closing that door. Give her back the one thing that was actually hers to keep, her house, her work, her independence, and give up forever the thing he wanted, which was her. Let the kindness be a real kindness for once, with no hook in it, no return expected, no ledger. I finally understood what you meant, he said. About going with empty hands, I thought it meant going to her with nothing to offer, but that wasn't it. It meant going with nothing to get. Empty hands going out, not just coming in. He did it that Wednesday. It took him the day, because doing it quiet took some arranging. He had to buy the note off Deacon through a lawyer in the county seat, an intermediary, papered so it couldn't be traced back to Silas Crane. And Deacon, who cared only about the money and not the meaning, sold it gladly enough for a small premium and never knew who'd bought it. By Wednesday evening, the note that had hung over Rachel Doyle's home for a year was paid in full and marked satisfied. And the papers were sent to her by the lawyer with a letter saying only that an anonymous party who wished her well had cleared the debt, and that she owed nothing to anyone, and that she should live in peace. And then Silas Crane got on his horse to ride back to my place and out of her life, having done the one right thing at last and got nothing for it, which was the whole point. That's where I thought the story ended. That's the ending I'd have written, sitting at my ledger, the bittersweet one, the man who learns too late, who does the noble thing and rides away alone, and the woman who lives in peace and never knows. It's a good hard ending, and it's the kind life usually hands you. But that's not what happened, because Rachel Doyle was every bit as sharp as she was proud, and she was nobody's mouse. She'd figured it out by Thursday morning. She was no fool, and the arithmetic wasn't hard once you knew there was a rich man in the story. An anonymous benefactor pays off her impossible debt, quietly, wanting nothing, the very week Silas Crane confesses on her porch and vanishes. She said later she'd known before she finished reading the lawyer's letter. She'd sat down at her own kitchen table, the one she'd nearly lost, and she'd read it twice, and then she'd put her face down on her folded arms and stayed like that a long while, and none of her boarders dared ask her what was wrong. Because it had undone her, that letter. Not the money, the shape of it. The man who'd tested her love because he couldn't believe in it had, at the very end, done the one thing that proved he'd finally learned too. He'd loved her the way she'd loved Sam Cole, for nothing, expecting nothing, getting nothing. He'd given her back her whole life and asked for not one thing in return, not even to be thanked, not even to be known. He'd done the thing she'd done all year, turning down Deacon, chosen to lose rather than buy what ought to be freely given. He'd finally, at the very end, become the man she'd fallen in love with, and done it in the act of disappearing. She came out to my ranch Thursday afternoon, in a hired buggy, in her good dress, and I met her in the yard not knowing who she was until she told me, and my heart went sideways because I didn't know yet whether she'd come to forgive him or to finish him. "Is he here?" she said, not really a question. "He's out at the far fence." I studied her. 40 years of buying and selling teaches you to read a face, but hers I couldn't read, and I've wondered since if that's because she hadn't finished reading it herself. "Ma'am, Mrs. Doyle, before you go out there." He rode to town to break his own heart honest, and he came back and did a thing that cost him everything and told nobody. Whatever you've come to do, he'll take it. He asked me not to defend him, and I won't. But I'll tell you one true thing about the man, since I've had him under my roof these months and you've only had the lie. I took a breath. The lie was the worst of him. What he did Wednesday was the best. And the best of him is real, ma'am. I've watched it come up out of the ground in him like water. Whatever you decide it about the whole man, because there's more to him now than the one who fooled you. He built the rest of it out here with his hands, and I watched him do it. She looked at me a long moment. You're the one who kept his secret, she said. I am, and I'm sorry for it. I told him from the first night he'd break the best thing in his life to test it. He didn't listen, and I didn't stop him, and I've written my own share of the blame in my book, if it's any comfort, which I don't expect it is. To my surprise, something in her face eased just slightly. No, she said, it's a little comfort, oddly. That somebody told him. And she turned and walked out toward the far fence, across the winter grass, in her good dress and her town shoes, and I did not follow because some accounts are between two people only, and an old man's got no business in the middle of them. I don't know everything they said out there. That's theirs, and I've never asked, and Sela's never told me all of it, and I think that's right. Some things a man ought to keep even from his ledger. But I know how it started, because they were close enough to the house at first that I heard it before I went inside to give them their privacy. And I've set down what I heard, because it was the truest exchange I think I ever overheard between two people, and it deserves keeping. She'd walked up to him at the fence. He'd turned and seen her and gone white, and he'd started to speak, and she'd stopped him. I know what you did, she'd said. The note, don't tell me it wasn't you, I know it was you. And Sela's, I'll give him this, he'd learned something after all. Sela's hadn't tried to arrange even this. He didn't say something clever. He didn't make it sound better than it was. He just said, I didn't do it to win you back, Rachel. I need you to believe that, and I know I've got no right to be believed about anything. I did it so you'd keep your home, that's all. I didn't want you to know. I wanted to do one thing in my life that didn't have a hook in it. I know, she'd said. That's the trouble. If you'd done it to win me back, I could have hated you clean. It'd have been more of your scheming. But you did it right. You did it the way I'd have done it. And then, quieter, the thing that I think turned the whole of both their lives, you finally did it the way Sam would have. He hadn't been able to answer that. I lost a poor man I loved, she'd said, and I've spent 3 days grieving him. And now I find out he was hiding inside a rich man who did a poor man's kindness at the end. I don't know how to feel about you, Sela's Crane. I'm not going to stand here and tell you all is forgiven, because it isn't, and it may take a long while, and some of it may never come all the way right. You did a cruel thing. Testing a person's love is a cruel thing, and being right about them doesn't make it kind. I know, he'd said. But, and here she'd stopped a long moment, and I could see even from the house what it cost her to go on. But I'm too old to throw away the one man in this county who'd give up everything he wanted just so I could keep what's mine. Men like that don't come but once if they come at all. And it seems the good Lord saw fit to hide mine inside a fool. I don't have to like the wrapping to want what's in it. That was as much as I heard. I went inside then, and I closed the door soft, the way Rachel had closed hers on him, only this door I was closing on the two of them together, and that's a different thing entirely. They stood out at that fence till near dark. I don't know what was decided exactly. I know it wasn't a wedding, not then, not for a good while. She was too proud and too hurt to be won back in an afternoon, and he was wise enough at last not to try to rush it, not to arrange it, not to buy it. What I know is that when the light was near gone, she walked back to her buggy, and he walked beside her, not touching her. A careful foot of winter air between them, and she got up in the buggy. And before she drove off, she looked down at him and said something I couldn't hear, and he nodded. And she came back the next Saturday to my ranch with a basket because she'd heard he wasn't eating enough. And there it was again, the same worried kindness she'd shown a poor stranger. Only now she knew exactly who she was feeding, and she fed him anyway, which is the only forgiveness that ever means anything, the kind that knows the whole cost and pays it slow. He kept working my place through the winter. That surprised me. He didn't go back to being Sela's Crane of the Bar Double C, not right off. He stayed a hand at tellers, mending fence and gentling horses, and rode to Cordell on Saturdays the way Sam Cole always had. And I came to understand he was doing it on purpose. He was letting her fall in love with the poor man again, honestly this time, with the truth on the table between them. Courting her slow as himself, both selves, the rich one and the poor one finally the same man. Earning back one Saturday at a time what he'd nearly lost in one alley. I don't know if they married in the end. I want to be honest with you, since I've been honest the whole way through. My part of the story ends that spring, when Sila's Sam, whoever he'd become by then, and I think he'd become somebody new, somebody made out of both, shook my hand in my yard and thanked me and told me he was going back to his own place at last, and that Rachel had agreed to come see it, which was further than she'd have gone at Christmas, and not as far as he wanted, and exactly as far as he'd earned. I sold him the green colt. He'd earned that too. I never learned the rest for certain. You hear things in a county. You hear a wedding did or didn't happen. You hear a man's happy or he isn't. But I stopped trusting what I heard secondhand a long time ago, and I'd rather not set down as truth in my ledger a thing I only heard at the feed store. So here's what I have. Here's the whole account balanced as near as I can balance it. A rich man so afraid of being loved for his money that he threw his money away to be sure, and learned at the bottom of it that the sureness he wanted was the one thing love won't ever give you. That you don't get to test it and prove it and take the risk out. That the taking of the risk is the love, and a love with the risk removed is just a transaction wearing a wedding dress. He'd spent 40 years making sure of everything, and the last true thing he did was let himself be unsure of the only thing that mattered, and give up everything he wanted, and let her decide with no thumb on the scale. And a woman who'd rather lose her home than tell a lie, who forgave a great deception not because it stopped hurting, but because she was too wise to trade a real man's flawed love for the clean satisfaction of hating him, who knew the difference between the wrapping and what's inside, and had the strength to want what was inside anyway. I've thought about which of them was braver. I thought about it that first night, and I've thought about it every year since. And I've decided it's a question with no answer, or the answers that they were brave in different currencies, and the whole marvel of it, if there was a marriage, and I hope there was, is that two people who'd each rather lose everything than lie about love found each other across a lie, and neither of them let the lie be the last word. I still keep the ledger. I'm too old now for much ranching, but a man keeps his habits, and I write in it most nights. And every so often I turn back to those pages, soft now at the corners, and I read the first entry, hired one hand, Sam Cole, no wages agreed, and the last one, and all the frightened, foolish, growing distance between. There's a thing I wrote near the end that I go back to more than the rest. I wrote it the night he rode home for the last time, and I don't fully understand it even now, but I know it's true the way the truest things are true, which is that you feel them before you can explain them.